Okay, sorry for the delay. More technical issues up here. It seems to be a daily fight with this stuff. All right, so last class we were talking about fossil fuels, and we sort of started with the background, what fossil fuels are, and now we're getting into the use of fossil fuels from kind of a big scale. And we ended up here, and this is a little messy, but a couple things to keep in mind. Probably the one figure I really want you to think about is this right here, this 7 billion barrels per year that we use here in the United States, okay? That comes out to be about 18 million barrels per day. And remember, a barrel is 42 gallons. So we talked last class about the use of oil and how 3/4 of all oil burned in human history have been burned in the last 40 years. And if we keep burning it at this rate, we're going to run out of our reserves well within your lifetime. A more likely scenario, though, is that before we get there, the supply is going to start running low. The demand is going to be really high. That means that prices are going to go way up. And at some point, alternatives are going to be more attractive financially for you. So my guess is that during your lifetime, we're going to see a switch from oil and gas being the predominant fuels for transportation and production of electricity to something else. I wish I knew what that something else was, because if you know what that something else was, you can make a lot of money going forward. But I'm not sure when. It could be a couple years from now, it could be 20 years from now, it could be 30 years from now. And it's likely to be triggered by an event that may not have anything to do with fossil fuels. We talked about how Russia's ruble being devalued resulted in them producing a whole bunch of oil and selling it so that they could simply make more money, and that dropped the price dramatically. And then when they stopped doing it, it spiked up again. So prices are controlled by a lot of different things, and a quick jump in prices is probably the trigger for moving towards one of the other alternatives, which we'll start talking about here a little later today and in the next class. Okay, so that's where we are now. So we are using oil at a rate that's unsustainable because it's a non-renewable resource. Okay, we're not going to run out of it, but we're going to switch to something else because it's going to get more expensive as the supply dwindles and the demand keeps going up. And remember that the picture here in the United States isn't particularly rosy because we have 4% of the world's population. We use 25 to 30% of the fossil fuels, and we can't produce enough of them ourselves. So we have to go to other countries to get them. And I showed you the list of countries that we import most of our oil from. These are not our good buddies politically worldwide. These are mostly countries in the Middle East or, in the case of Venezuela, South America, that have been at times openly hostile towards us. So we are sending an awful lot of our economic prosperity to countries that don't like us very much, build their war machine with the money we send them, which forces us to spend more of our tax money to build our military in response. So it's just a bad situation all along. Okay, so what can we do about it? You know, I don't like to just piss and moan about, oh, these are the problems. What can we actually do about it? Well, some people have suggested, hey, let's import more oil from these other countries. And you might think, what the hell's the strategy for that? Well, because we have limited reserves here in the US, the idea is take their oil when we can get their oil. Yes, we do send them the money. Yes, it does help them economically. But what it does is it allows us to save our oil here for times in the future where maybe we're at odds with some of these other countries. They don't want to send us oil. So we're basically keeping our oil in the bank for a rainy day. And that rainy day is the time where we're at political odds with our enemies that we like to import oil from. As it turns out, this is probably not a real practical idea, because if we just import more and produce less, what does that do to the United States energy producing companies? They can't produce as much, right? So they're going to have to lay off people. And who are they going to lay off? Us, Americans, that have these jobs. And as it turns out, the oil company jobs are very good jobs. They pay high, they have great benefits. That's a real hardship for these folks that are in this industry. You know, I'm not a big fan of fossil fuels, even though my family is hugely invested in them. But there's no denying the fact that these companies provide great jobs to a lot of Americans. And you can't just tell these American companies, hey, why don't you just shut down for a while until we really need you? That's just really not going to fly very well. So there's obviously going to be some huge political consequences to this sort of strategy. Not many politicians are going to want to go down this road. You know, there is a big cry from a lot of people here in the US to move away from fossil fuels as quickly as possible. I understand that. It's contributing to climate change, and we're seeing some of the results of that now. But we don't have a strategy for doing it. Right now, the only strategy is just let the free market sort of do its thing. And you can argue that that maybe is the best strategy. But I grew up at a time when I was your age, our congressional leaders and president actually had an energy policy. They had plans for how they wanted energy to be produced and what we wanted to move for. We haven't done that in a couple of decades. And a lot of us that grew up during that time really want to see our Congress and our president come up with an energy policy that makes sense, moving us away from fossil fuels, but in a way that preserves jobs, helps to protect the environment. It can be done, but we have such political division in this country right now that it's just not happening. As I said, you know, this sort of strategy really forces us to take a huge industry in the US that employs a lot of people and tell them just to sort of mothball for a while. It's unlikely that this approach is something that any politician's going to buy into. Okay, so if we're not going to import more, one potential strategy is let's just go find more. That'd be great. But the sad fact is that there's probably not a lot of big discoveries left. We've been looking for oil for 100 years. It's a very profitable business. So people have been highly motivated to find this stuff. So it's a pretty unusual circumstance where you can still find large untapped reserves of oil and natural gas out in the world somewhere. The one exception to this may be the country of Myanmar, also known as Burma. This is a really secretive country. It was largely under military rule for decades. It's an impoverished country. It's a poor country. Run by the military. The military was not open to having outsiders come in and do business. So a lot of their resources just sort of sat and were not exploited. I'll show you some more pictures of Myanmar here in a little bit. But Myanmar has some vast oil deposits that haven't been exploited yet. And the reason it hasn't been exploited is that they were under military rule for so long. But since 2012, they've been moving towards a more democratic style of government, and they're slowly allowing other countries to come in and do business with them. China has been all over Myanmar. They border Myanmar. Myanmar has a fair bit of oil. Do you remember how much oil China has? Nothing. So they are hot to get Myanmar's oil. And in fact, they are building pipelines across Myanmar that will take Myanmar's oil and bring it to China. Many in Myanmar want this because it develops their economy, it gives them jobs. I was lucky enough to visit Myanmar 5 years ago. It's an amazing country, beautiful, but the people are very poor. People are very happy, though, too. It's a real agriculturally based lifestyle and country. Lots of farming, plenty of food, but just not much money. But, they're opening up, they're getting the internet, they're seeing how the rest of the world lives, and they want some of those niceties that you have. They want your cell phones. But they're having a hard time getting people to come and do business. One is that their infrastructure is so poor. The electricity is only on a couple hours a day, and you don't know when. It could be any time of the day. It might be on for an hour and then it shuts off for 6 hours. Then it's on for 3 hours, then shuts off for a day and a half. Now, if you're a person that has a company in a foreign land and is thinking about Myanmar, that's not a great situation to try to move a new business into, where you have infrastructure that's so unreliable. So they're having a really hard time attracting people. So they want to build their infrastructure so that it's reliable. So they want to sell their oil so that they can get the money to build better infrastructure that will attract new businesses and the whole country can start to grow and prosper. That's their idea, but it's taking time. But the fact remains is that that's an unusual circumstance where you have an entire country and its resources basically walled off to the rest of the world for such a long period of time. So we're not likely to find many more big discoveries out there. So if we're not going to import more, and if there's not a lot of other discoveries to be made, then that really puts a lot of pressure on going into areas that have been set aside for other reasons to look for resources on. And one are our protected lands, our lands in national parks, monuments, wildlife refuge. A lot of these areas are off limits to oil, gas, and mining. But one particular area has been at the heart of a lot of controversy over the last, well, it's going on 40 years now. And this is Anwar, the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. This area was back in the news this week with the presidential election coming up. The Republicans really want to open the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge to drilling, and they have since the late 1970s when this refuge was created. And the Democrats have been pushing to permanently protect this area for the last 40 years. It was allowed to be a refuge back in the late 1970s as an agreement between the Republicans and the Democrats. Jimmy Carter signed this bill that said, we have this refuge, but unlike other wildlife refugees that we have in the U.S., we're going to leave open the possibility that you can drill on it. That was the only way they could get enough support from both the Republicans and the Democrats to actually protect this land. But there's always been this little line in the original bill that said, potentially we can open this for oil and gas drilling. And It sits right next to one of the richest oil fields ever discovered, Prudhoe Bay, which is up on the north slope of Alaska. Very few people visit up there, but Prudhoe Bay has been drilled into for the last half a century. U.S. companies have extracted a lot of oil from up there. Arctic National Wildlife Refuge lies right next to it. There's potentially a lot of oil on there. 10 billion barrels, perhaps. So 10 billion barrels at anywhere between maybe $50 and $100 per barrel. You're looking at maybe $1 trillion worth of oil. A lot of people are going to want $1 trillion. Okay, so there's been a lot of pressure by the oil companies to open this up for drilling. I interviewed with Shell Oil back in the late 1980s. Okay, so this was 35 years ago. And when I visited the group that I was interviewing to work for, this is what they were working on. Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. Even though it wasn't open to drilling at the time, they were sure that someday it would be opened up to drilling, and they wanted to be ready to go in, identify the best areas to drill so that they could get the leases. So people were working on this back in the 1980s and 70s. They're still working on it today. They figure, at some point, we're going to start running low on supply. The demand's going to increase, price is going to go up. There's going to be more and more pressure for us to eventually open this up to drilling. And the Democrats have managed to protect it for almost 40 years. But in 2017, the Trump administration, along with senators from the Republican Party in the Senate and Republican congressmen in the House, finally opened this up to drilling, sort of. They're allowing the sale of leases for this area. And those leases have not gone up for sale. The Trump administration right now is rushing to sell the leases because once the leases are sold, it's really difficult to sort of put that back in the bottom. If Biden gets elected next week and says, no, we're going to close it down, he's going to have a hard time closing it down if the leases have already been approved. Because then the companies can say, hey, we spent all this money on this, and now you're taking this away from us, and they'll have a solid court case. So there's this rush right now to get the leases out. Environmental groups are suing to prevent the leases. It's a real time crunch, and it's coming down to this fall. I don't know how it's going to play out. I don't know if they're going to be able to sell the leases before Biden, if he does win, gets in. If Trump administration stays in, then this is definitely going to be opened up. But has anybody in here been to the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge? I've never had a student who's ever been there. And I only know like 3 people that have ever visited there, okay? So most people don't even know what this area is like. I want to show you what it's like. So this is a video from, it's actually been a little while, but really nothing's changed from the video except now we have the prospect of leases. So I'm going to switch over here. This will take me a minute to queue up a video, but it's maybe 10 minutes long. It'll show you what the Arctic National Wildlife looks like. What I want you to keep in mind is, remember, you guys remember how much oil we use here in the United States per year? 7 billion. So keep that in mind, okay? You'll hear some numbers about how much oil is up there. So I want you to keep that in mind and listen to the acreages of not only how big the refuge is, but how much area is going to be disturbed, okay? Okay. So again, just to sort of recap, this is a huge area, 19 million acres, bigger than some states. Projected land disturbance is actually very small. They don't plan on disturbing many acres. What were they going to make the roads out of? Ice. What's really interesting is back in the 1970s, they projected that they would have 6 to 7 months of the year where the ice roads would be stable. But because of climate change, Largely because of burning fossil fuels, the warming temperatures in the Arctic have now reduced those number of days by a month or two. So the roads actually won't be as stable as long as the oil companies had originally projected back in the late 1970s and early 80s. Projected reserves 4 to 11 billion barrels. We don't know for sure because we haven't allowed seismic testing. That's one of the primary tools that oil companies use to get a view of how the rocks are oriented in the subsurface. So we don't exactly know how much oil is there, but it could be a half a year's worth to a year and a half worth. Not a lot in terms of our overall oil consumption, but from a dollar standpoint, that could be upwards of $1 trillion that we won't be importing from other countries. So that's a big argument for opening this up. Then again, this is another 4 to 11 billion barrels that we will be burning and contributing to climate change in a protected area that may have in the future some fairly large tourism potential as well. Like I said, it's going to take at least a decade, even if the leases are sold this year. And it's going to be tight. There's a lot of lawsuits that are holding up the sale of the leases. If the Trump administration stays in, they have plenty of time for the leases to wait for the lawsuits to pass. Even with the lawsuits, they might be able to have some leases sold in late 2020 this year. If Biden gets elected, my guess is on day one, if the leases aren't sold, he will put in an executive order to stop the sale of all leases on day one. So it's definitely a political football this year. So again, on the big picture, this isn't a lot of oil. Might save you a penny down the road. It's only maybe 1% of the world's oil consumption. But from a dollar standpoint, it's huge. Again, that's money we're not sending to our enemies. That's jobs those are jobs that are being created and paying Americans here in the US. Like I always say, if you're gonna protest a mine or an oil company, that's fine. But you have to realize that that doesn't do anything to the demand, right? We still want energy. And if we don't get it here, where are we going to get it? Somewhere else, probably some other country. And a lot of times what happens, we're not going to talk about mining so much, but when you think about mining, a lot of people don't want mining in their backyard. I totally get that. I don't want mining in my backyard. It's a dirty business. But if you shut down a mine here in the US, are you doing anything about the demand? No. What you're actually doing is cutting down the supply, which drives the price up, which makes it even more attractive for miners. They're just going to go to a country where they can do it more cheaply, where environmental regulations don't exist. So a lot of times protesting mines and protesting drilling here in the US actually leads to more environmental damage elsewhere. At least here in the US, we have laws that attempt to protect the environment. You go to Mexico or Brazil or Indonesia, you can get away with polluting the land to a much greater degree than you can here. But at the end of the day, do we want to open our protected lands? These are lands that were set aside because they were special. Do we want to do this for, if you're looking at it from a big picture, a relatively small amount of oil? And that comes down to you and how you vote. Again, remember, these are the countries we get most of our oil from. And remember, Canada reports their oil different. We import oil from Canada, but they're importing the oil from the Middle East. They're producing some of their own. But when we import Canadian oil, we're importing some oil that they produced in Canada and some that they imported from other countries. So at the end of the day, we're getting a huge percentage of our imported oil from countries that we don't get along with well politically. So again, it's not a simple question. Yay, we should protect the land. Yay, we should open it up to drilling. It's not simple. I mentioned Myanmar before. This is Myanmar. There's a lot of oil in Myanmar, and it's really close to the surface. In fact, it's so close that people that live there can dig down with shovels and get it, or build these simple wells that they then pump by hand. So they pump oil by hand and put it in whatever sort of containers they can, bring it into town and sell it. And you can see that the conditions can be really rough. Burma has a really pronounced wet and dry season. And when it's wet, it rains all the time. It's just a muddy, horrid mess. A lot of times the local kids will pump oil before going to school. Then they show up to school and this is what they look like. So there's child labor. It's a tough place. Here is a pipeline that's currently being built that's going to take oil from the coast of Myanmar on the Bay of Bengal and transport it all the way to Nanking, China, which is I think a city of well over 10 million, where it'll then be refined and used for the Chinese that need access to gas and oil. And this is difficult, but it kind of shows all the different oil areas and the different oil leases. And you can see the countries that have picked up the leases. You see a lot of them are Chinese. You got some in Russia, Indonesia, Singapore. I think the only US company that's on there is Chevron. So they have a small lease. So the US is not heavily going after this oil, but China is heavily going after it. You see Australia wants some of it, Russia wants some of it. Everybody wants a piece of it. And Myanmar definitely wants to sell it because they want the money so they can build their infrastructure that will attract new businesses and their country can come out of the dark ages and move on. Okay. So we've been talking about the future of oil. We're going to start running out of the easily extracted oil. The demand is still going up. We're adding people. We're adding mechanization. We need energy. So we can either import more, look for new discoveries, drill on protected lands. All of those have difficulties. Now, one thing we are doing, and we're doing a lot of this here in the US, is we're going back into oil fields that have been pumped already. Remember, we've been extracting oil for quite a while in this country, and the technology keeps getting better. And when you pump oil out of the ground, you don't get it all. If you're lucky, you might get 50%. So a lot of it is still left in the ground. So some companies are finding that it's profitable to take their new technology into places that have already been pumped and pump them again, repump them with the new technology. For a while, what we were doing is we were actually pumping basically hot water into the ground. And what that hot water would do is it would push the oil, and we could do it in a manner where we could push it towards a new extraction well. The hot water would make the oil more mobile, so we could extract more of it. And in some places, it worked fairly well. Now, remember a couple classes ago, we were talking about source rocks and trap rocks? One of the best source rocks for oils are shales. Shales contain a lot of organic matter. The problem with shales is that the rock is so fine grained that there's not much pore space in the shale for the oil to flow through. So if you drilled straight down into a shale, you might be able to suck a little oil from around your drill hole, but because it's not porous, oil from far away couldn't flow in very well. So we would ignore shales, okay? Shales were rocks that you just did not pump, just didn't drill into because the extraction rates were so low. But we knew that there was lots of oil and gas in the shale itself, and what we typically had to do with old technology is you had to wait for the oil to slowly migrate out of the shales into a rock that you could more easily extract it from, something like a sandstone or a limestone. But then in the early 2000s, about 20 years ago, all that investment money that went into the stock market in the 1990s, two companies in particular, Halliburton and Schlumberger, you've probably heard of these two companies. They're very, very profitable companies. They're drilling companies. That's all they do is they drill for oil. So when Shell and Chevron and all these companies find a place to drill, they hire Halliburton or they hire Schlumberger to go in and do the drilling. And it used to be that we just drill straight down, try to suck out as much oil as possible. But in the early 2000s, we came up with this really cool new technology that allowed us to drill down vertically and then turn and go horizontally. And what they found out is that we could go into a shale unit and then drill sideways for miles. And that would allow all this new area to be exposed. And they figured out, we can finally drill into these shales that we've been ignoring since we started drilling for oil. And what's even better is before you pump those shales, if you pump water into them at really high pressure, you can fracture the shales, you can break them. And all those breaks allow even more pathways for the oil and gas to come in. So it's called fracking. So basically two technologies, this directional horizontal drilling combined with fracturing of the rock made all these shale units suddenly super profitable. And here in Colorado, if you look at the geology out here on the prairie, it's mostly shale units. So we've been ignoring these rock units for decades because we didn't really have good technology. Suddenly we have these two new technologies, fracking and horizontal drilling, that allow us to go in and extract these things. And I've talked about my family oil business. My wife's grandfather, way back in the 40s, bought up tons of land in West Texas. It was just ranch land, but he bought it for the oil rights. But the problem is that all the rock underneath was shale. So it was useless, so he just sat on this old ranch land and it's been in my wife's family forever. But then since 2000, suddenly all these other oil companies realized, wow, look at all this land in West Texas that has all these shale units that we can now drill into. So my wife's family have made gazillions of dollars selling off oil leases to their grandfather's land. For a while we didn't know if her grandfather was brilliant or a dope because he bought all this completely useless land. And he had paid all these taxes on it, never made any money on it. And now their family has just ridiculous amounts of money because Suddenly it's valuable, but because of this new technology. There's no way your grandfather could have known this new technology was going to go along. So I think he just got lucky. That's my view of it. But I guess you could argue that he was, a visionary, way ahead of his time. Anyway, this new technology, fracturing the rock and directional drilling, can result in about 40% more production in these areas. And it's been estimated we can get 50 billion barrels now from these shale units. 50 billion. How much do we use a year? 7. So this is 7 to 10 years worth of oil. That's a significant amount. Way more than at Anwar, right? 5 to 10 times more. So that's what's happening out here. If you look east of Greeley and you see all the oil production, this is what's going on. They are going down and drilling into these shale units. This is kind of what it looks like. So these units are deep. And the way it works is you drill down from the surface until you find whatever rock unit you think has the oil in, and then you turn the drilling sideways and you go horizontally. And sometimes this will go for miles, 3, 4, 5 miles. And what's interesting is it might cut across several leases. One company might have this lease, and another company might have this lease, another company might have this lease. And what will happen is they'll all get together and hire a drilling company and then say, I've got 20% of the lease, I get 20% of the oil. You have 30% of the lease, you get 30% of the oil. So these companies get together and kind of do a deal and make a single well. And then they just sort of split the amount that comes out. But before they pump, what they do is they pump water down into really high pressure to break the rock. Okay? And that's called fracking, hydraulic fracturing. And that just gives more pathways for the oil and gas to travel through. And then they suck the water back out. And then what they'll do, and they're not showing it here, is they'll move several miles away and they'll drill a hole really deep into the earth and pump all that wastewater into it to get rid of it. Because remember, they're pumping into a unit that's full of oil and gas. The water that comes out is pretty nasty. You can't just go dump it into a stream. So what they do is they pump it deep into the earth. And the problem is that every once in a while they'll pump it into a fault line. They don't know that fault's down there until they pump the water in, and the water sort of gets in the fault line and starts producing earthquakes. So you're getting a lot of fracking-induced earthquakes in oil regions, and it's because of the wastewater. It takes about 5 to 10 million gallons of water to frack a well. That's a lot of water, and you can't just go dump it. So it's called an injection well. So they inject it deep into the earth. So that's the process: is you drill down, find your rock unit, drill horizontally along it for as long as you can, pump water down at high pressure to break it, suck that water out, inject that water somewhere else deeper into the earth, and then start pumping that area for oil and gas. And it works great. Works really well. We've actually been fracking wells since the 1940s, but we didn't do it much because we didn't have this directional drilling, and it really didn't help much. We haven't really fracked large scale until starting in the late 2000s, so about 15 years. That's when fracking really took off, is at the same time that this horizontal drilling took place. We didn't used to be able to do this. This is a really new sort of invention. So we're going to talk a little about fracking. We'll start today. So I told you before that you pump water into the ground. Well, it's actually a little more complicated. It's mostly water, but there's some other things we put in that water. We put a lot of sand in the water. And the reason that the water is laced with sand is once you break the rock, You want those fractures to stay open. You don't want them to close back up. Remember, they're under a lot of pressure deep in the ground. So what the sand does is it gets into the cracks and keeps them open. It props them open. It's called proppant. It's just sand. And then because sand is really porous, the oil and gas can flow through it. And there's a bunch of other chemicals that are stuck into it as well. We'll talk about the chemicals here in a minute. But the idea is you drill down deep. Now, the thing, too, is that you're pumping this water down from the surface, and it's under really high pressure. And it's filled with sand and all these other chemicals. What you don't want is for the fracking fluid to somehow leak into your groundwater, which is up higher. So what they do is they do something to the well called casing it. They line it either in steel or high-grade concrete. And that keeps the fracking fluid from leaking into the shallow rock units and polluting the groundwater. And 99 times out of 100, it works great. But every once in a while, they screw it up. And they don't do their concrete right, and they don't case their well, and fracking fluid can leak into the groundwater. And if you're a rancher and you have a well, and your well gets contaminated by fracking fluid, you are hosed. You can't clean this up. So where do you get water? If you can't get it out of the ground, you have no nearby streams, you're really screwed. There's no farming or ranching that exists without water. Especially out here in the dry West, we get a lot of water from the ground. And if these oil companies mess it up, which they don't do often, but they do it sometimes, then they can completely destroy these ranches. Now, if you talk to the oil companies, they say, oh, fracking is completely safe. This almost never happens. Well, it's true. It almost never happens. But sometimes it does. And if you talk to the environmentalists, they'll say, oh, this happens all the time. No, it doesn't happen all the time, but it does happen. And my issue is when it does happen, the oil companies should compensate these ranchers. Most of the time, the oil companies will say, oh, you had oil and gas in your water before, you just didn't know it. Because what lies beneath this aquifer? What's down here really deep? A shale unit with oil and gas, right? What does the oil and gas want to do? It wants to rise up. And it is likely that these ranches had a little bit of oil and gas in their water. They probably did, but just a little bit. But because they messed up their fracking, now they have a lot of it. But how are you going to prove that if you're a rancher? The only way you prove it is by having a whole bunch of water samples before they frack, and then see how the water changes after. But people don't do that. If I had a ranch, I would do that. I would insist you take water samples for 6 months, you test it, and if anything goes up by more than 2%, you're paying me. You're relocating me. And you can do that as a rancher. You can insist on that. But nobody does it. So if they pollute your water, you end up getting screwed. Okay, we'll spend a couple minutes talking about fracking. This ended up becoming a big political issue again. I don't know if any of you saw the debate last week. But like I said, a lot of people on the left side of the political spectrum want fracking to go away because of the potential harm to groundwater and because, for the most part, they want to see fossil fuels go away. And if you talk to people on the right, they want fracking to continue so that we can increase our oil and gas extraction, not send our money to other countries, provide good jobs to those of us in the U.S. Both sides have valid arguments. It'd be nice if we could have both. It'd be nice if we could have great clean energy production with lots of good jobs and a really clean environment. As it turns out, those two are almost always at odds with one another. And what happened in the last debate was Joe Biden said that he doesn't want to ban fracking. He says we need to keep fracking for a few years until we can move to another energy source. And a lot of folks on the left didn't like that answer because they want fracking to go away. So it's become an issue again. So it's probably worth talking about what fracking is, what the dangers really are. So again, this is something we've been doing. I think the first well was fracked in 1947. So, you know, over 70 years. But it was done rarely until about 2005 or 6. But fracking combined with this directional horizontal drilling has been proven really effective for increasing the amount of oil and gas we can get out of shale units. So now, as it turns out, most of our wells are fracked here in the US. But there's been some problems. We have earthquakes in areas we haven't had earthquakes. We have water that's getting polluted. Some cities have banned it. There's several cities in Texas that have banned fracking. Boulder tried to ban fracking a few years ago, actually passed a bill. They were sued by the Colorado Oil and Gas Commission. The Oil and Gas Commission won. So City of Boulder actually had to start selling leases, but they didn't want to. So they basically found every way in the world to stall and kept stalling and kept stalling. So they got sued again. It's kind of a clown car between Colorado Oil and Gas and Boulder right now. So again, this is typically done in shales, which we know are the source rocks for a lot of oil and especially natural gas. But they were avoided by drilling companies because we just couldn't suck much out of them because they have very low levels of porosity and permeability. But if we frack them, suddenly they have much higher levels of porosity and permeability. Like I said, the first frack well was back in the 1940s, and I think they did it with dynamite, which is a really horrible idea. Throwing dynamite into a hole that has volatile gas, it's kind of stupid, but you know, it's fun to blow stuff up. We found out it's better to do it with high pressure water. And we didn't frack that many until about 2005, but then once we started looking at these shale units, then we just fracked them all. So now over 2.5 million wells. This is as 2012. It's basically doubled since then. But some countries have completely banned it. England has completely banned fracking. Can't frack on any well on England or offshore England as well. It's definitely under attack here in the US. The oil companies for years said, oh, these earthquakes, they're not from fracking, and the polluted water, not from fracking. You can't prove it's from fracking. Well, government geologists have proven without doubt that a lot of the earthquakes we're getting here in the mid part of the US, Oklahoma, parts of Colorado. We had an earthquake here in Greeley a couple of years ago, magnitude 3, that was definitely fracking induced. They've had lots of trouble with groundwater pollution in Pennsylvania, fracking into the Marcellus Shale. Without a doubt, oil and gas production increases seismicity and pollutes some groundwater. The vast majority of frack wells are done correctly, perfectly safe. Vast majority, 99.999 whatever. But when you have 2.5 to 3 million fracked wells, even if one out of every 100,000 wells gets messed up, you're still talking about a lot of wells that are able to damage groundwater for thousands, tens of thousands, perhaps more people. So it's rare that it gets messed up, but when it does, it has a really horrible effect, sometimes on a lot of folks. So to understand this whole process and give you a little background, then we're going to finish it up next class. So I've used a couple of terms. Porosity, that's the percentage of void space in rocks. Typically, shales have moderate porosity, but we'll talk about why they are not. The second term, which is permeable. Permeability is what we're really after when we want to extract oil and gas. Permeability talks about how easily liquids and gases travel through rock. So it depends on how many pores are there, but really it depends on how connected the pores are. Some rocks just don't have much porosity at all. There's just no space for the fluids to flow through. Things like sandstones can be 20 to 30% porous, and all of those pores are connected. So oil and gas flows really easily through something like a sandstone. Shales are kind of weird because they do have some pores, but the pores tend to be so small and not connected that stuff just doesn't flow through them very well. Now, this is something we talked about a little earlier back in the soils chapter. And this is why fracking actually works. Remember, it's hard to break a rock. Rocks don't like to break. Remember, if you take a rock and bash it with a hammer, it doesn't break very well. And what we're talking about fracking is breaking rock. What companies have figured out is that they can exploit a property of rock that we talked about already. Remember, when you compress a rock, it's really strong. So beating on it with a hammer, it's really difficult to break it. But rocks are really weak under tension, being pried apart. And that's how fracking is going to work. Fracking is going to break rock because the water is getting into really tiny pre-existing crack and wedging them apart, putting them under tension so that the rock breaks easy. The other thing that fracking plays off of is another property of rocks called fracture toughness. What that means is that if a crack already exists, it doesn't take much energy to make the crack longer. So I don't urge you to do this, but you can kind of test this on your own with your windshield. Okay, if you take your thumb and push it on your windshield, you're not going to make a crack in it. Okay, but if you have a crack that's going across your windshield, right at the end of it, if you put your thumb there, you can actually make the crack go in all sorts of directions. I do this on my windshield every time it gets hit with a rock. As I put my thumb and I push it around, I can make the crack go all sorts of crazy directions. Once you have a crack, it's really easy to keep it going. Making a crack is really tough. So that's kind of what fracking does, is it takes pre-existing cracks in the rocks and makes them bigger by prying them apart. So I think I'll just end here. We'll come back to this next class, so you don't have to copy this down. I'll put this up at the beginning of next class since we're out of time. And we'll talk about exactly how fracturing works. We'll talk more about politics. Next time we meet will be election day, so it's a good time to talk about politics. Go vote. Vote early. Don't vote often. And I'll see you guys next week.